And welcome back, students. Let's get into our next piece of programming 2, knowledge and learning. Let's get into overriding a method definition. So let's first kind of talk about overriding. The definition of an inherited method that can be changed in the definition of a derived class so that it has a meaning the derived class is different from what it is in the base class. That might seem a little confusing, but pretty much in a nutshell, what that means is that you can actually change your methods in the derived class from what they do in the base class. So yes, remember before we said in the previous lesson, we said if a method is derived, you don't have to put it back in. Well, if you put it back in, you can override that and have it actually perform differently. All right, this is called overriding, the definition of the inherited method. So for example, the methods toString and equals are overridden or redefined in the definition of the derived class hourly employee. They also overridden in the class salary employee. So if I pop over to Eclipse here, and if we look, we have a toString method right here in employee. It says return name plus space plus hire date dot toString. If I look at hourly employee, you can see it returns get name plus space plus get hire date dot toString plus, and then it spreads out the wage rate per hour, blah blah blah, all that other stuff. Same thing with salaried employee. You can see that it will also print out something totally different. Right? So that's what these here will do. To override a method definition, simply give the new definition method in the class definition, just as you would with the method that is added in the derived class. All right, we can see that here. Pretty much, if you want to override an hourly employee and in salaried employee, you would just whatever the name of that original method was. In this case, toString. I would do the same thing here in hourly and salaried employee with toString. All right, before we jump into things, I just want to mention something known as the final modifier. If you add the modifier final to the definition of a method, it indicates that method cannot be redefined in a derived class. So if I had in my base class of employee the modifier final, I would not be able to use that toString method. Well, I should say I can still use it, but I can't redefine what it's doing in the derived class. I have to pretty much use it as is. Whatever is in the base class, if it has the final modifier, you can't redefine. You can't change what it's doing. If you add the final modifier, or the modifier final, excuse me, to the definition of a class, it indicates that the class may not be used as a base class to derive other classes. And we'll talk more about the final modifier in a later chapter, so don't worry about it too much now. It's mostly just kind of being mentioned so you can kind of put it in the back of your mind. All right, let's talk about changing the return type of an overridden method. In a derived class, you can override or change the definition of a method from the base class, as I've kind of already alluded to with toString. As a general rule, when you're overriding a method definition, you may not change the type returned by the method, and you may not change a void method to a method returns value, nor a method returns a value to a void method. So largely speaking, you can't ultimately change what the method will return, but more often than not, you're not necessarily looking at changing that. You just create a different method then. Instead, you're looking at what the method executes inside of the actual body of the method. Now, there is one exception to this rule, which is if the return type is a class type, then you may change the return type to that of any descendant class of the return type. So if the return type was originally employee, you can now change it to like hourly employee. All right, so that leads us into covariant return types. So for example, if a function returns the type employee, when you have overridden the function definition in a derived class, you may change the return type to hourly employee, salaried employee, or any other descendant class of the class employee. Remember before we had the hierarchy chart, we had one that was like technical staff, clerical staff. So if you had like a clerical employee, they could also technically rewrite that definition. Now, this sort of change type is, as I mentioned, a covariant return type. This actually was not something that was in the early versions of Java. Pretty much in the early version of Java, there was absolutely no way you can make changes to the return type. In the newer versions of Java, 5.0 and newer, pretty much you can make these changes. And most of what we're going to be working with always deals with these newer versions. It's just a footnote to note in case if for some reason you're working with some weird legacy code. Now, We'll give some complete examples of changing the return type of an overridden method again in a later chapter, like when we talk about the final modifier and stuff like that. For now, let's just kind of outline an example. So suppose we have a class definition which includes the following details. Public class, base class, public employee get someone into someone key, All right, so this is in the base class. In this case, the following details would be allowed then in a derived class. Public class, derived class, extends base class. Public hourly employee gets someone into some key. Pretty straightforward. When the method definition for get someone is overridden in the derived class, the return type is changed therefore from employee to hourly employee. As you'll notice here, it was public employee, now it is public hourly employee. Covariance still, if it is worth noting that if you change the return type of an overridden method in this way, as I just showed, such as employee to hourly employee, you're not really changing the return type so much as placing additional restrictions upon it. And that's kind of how you get around Java's rule. You can't really change it. And this is because you're using class types, not like primitive types. Every hourly employee is technically an employee object. It just has additional properties that, while they are of every hourly employee, aren't necessarily of employee. So really you're kind of saying, I want you to create this class object with restrictions. So if you have, let's say, an hour employee, if we look at a part-time employee, if you create further restrictions, then that would be even more restricted because now you're restricting it down to a smaller data set. Any code that was written for a method of the base class and that assumed the value returned by the method is employee will be legal for an overridden version of the method that returns an hourly employee. This is true because every hourly employee is an employee. Remember, not every employee is hourly, but every hourly employee is still an employee. Just like every salaried employee is an employee, but not every employee is on salary. All right, let's talk about changing the access permission of an overridden method. You can change the access permission of an overridden method from private in the base class to public in a derived class, or in any other way that makes access permissions more permissive. So, for example, if the following is a method in the base class, then you'll do private void do something. Then you can use the following heading when overriding the method definition in the derived class. Public void do something. So, with derived class, you're allowed to change it from private to public. Now note, you can't do it the other way around. All right, you can't make them from more restricted into a derived class because it's derived. So you can go private to public, but you can't go public to private. It doesn't work that way because you can always make, in terms of permissions like this, you can always make it more open, but you can't make it less because the thing is you can't, because the base class is ultimately what you're pulling from, you can't go and make it more restrictive than what the base class already has. You have to operate within the rules of that base class. All right, and this makes sense because you want code written for the base class method to be able to work for your derived class method. You can use a public method any place. You can use private, but it is not true that you can use a private any place you use public. All right, now talk about our pitfall. Yay, pitfalls. We love these things because they always are the bane of programmers. All right, overriding versus overloading. All right, if you recall, overloading a method is a technique we talked all the way back in programming 1. Now we're going to bring it back up as we talk about that versus overriding. Important thing to note is don't get them confused. All right, even though they both have over in the name, they function very differently. When you override a method definition, the new method definition given in the derived class has the exact same number of and types of parameters. Right? Compare that to if the method in the derived class would have a different number of parameters or a parameter of a different type from the method in the base class, then your derived class would have both methods of overriding and overloading. Specifically, though, at this point, we'd probably more likely consider this to be overloading, right? Because you're changing the parameter values. Whereas if you look at overriding, it's more of you just change what happens inside the method. That's a good way to kind of think about overriding, more like change what the method does. Overload, more like change the parameters of the method. All right. For example, suppose we add the following method to the definition of the class hourly employee. Poke void set name, string first name, string last name. If name is not null and last name is not null, system out print line fatal error setting employee name. Right, so if they're null, in other words, if there's no value given, crash the program. Otherwise, just name equals first name plus space plus last name. I think that's a pretty simple thing. All right. The class hourly employee then would have this two argument method set name, and it would also inherit the following one argument method set name from the base class employee. Public void set name string new name if name or new name is equal to null, fatal error, crash the system, else name equals new name. All right. So now there's two ways of pretty much saying the name. Well, the class hourly employee has two methods named set name. This would technically be overloading the method that is named set name. And remember, when you do this, you have to specify with different parameters. On the other hand, both the class employee and the class hourly employee define a method with the following method heading: string to string. In this case, the class hourly employee has only one method named toString, but the definition of the method toString in the class hourly employee is different from the definition of the math of the employee toString. Right? In fact, the method toString has been overridden, or that is redefined. If you are writing and overloading confused, just know that both are legal to use. And again, as I point out, the kicker here to keep them straight is when we look at these methods here, we look at, for example, the toString methods, right? You'll notice with the parameters, this is an empty parameter. There's nothing being passed. Same thing here, all right? That is what clues me in here as whether or not is this overloading or is this overriding. Because the names are the same and the parameter values are the same, I'm going to go with that these are overriding. Whereas when I look here at these methods, you'll see that with these ones, yes, they have, it's like public void set name, string first name, string last name, and here we have just string name. Right? So here, what do you notice? The methods are different parameters. Right? And when we say that there's different parameters, then we say that that tends to be overloaded. So that's the key thing to remember. So if different number of parameters or different type of parameters, overloading. Otherwise, if the parameters are the same, but the method definitions themselves are different, then you have an overriding. All right. Hopefully that helps clear that all up for you today, folks. And we will see you next time.